possibilities of the sexual liberation into our current moment. I wonder if you want to talk a little more about that.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the sexual revolution, and so it was a period of quite a lot of indulgence, which you allude to in wanting to experience that, not growing up as an older person. Anyway, so I experienced the sexual revolution, and parts of it were wonderful, of course, and parts of it are not wonderful, but it was fun, and it was a delightful to be sexually free. I loved it, and so I wanted to. That poem is about. You're right. It's nostalgic. It's about the sexual revolution being a positive memory, and we lost that. And I feel for the people that didn't have that experience. I really do. And yet, it's what I believe led to. There being such a epidemic that there was so much sex going on with that sexual freedom during that time of the late 60s and 70s, that whole period that built up to when AIDS started appearing in early 80s.
And John, in your book there, I think there's this a slightly different relationship to sin in a certain sense, where there's a camaraderie among gay men in the book, which in some ways does come through I think there's some of the parts that feel, there's a couple monologues sort of talking about perversion, right? And invoking, the possibilities of that perversion and sort of the outcast status. Even though the book itself, in many ways, is sort of investigating a particular moment, which is not perhaps considered one of the most hopeful moments, and is not necessarily that hopeful, in your book. I think there is a sort of hope in that perversion. Would you say so?
Thanks, Matilda. Perversion really isn't a word I would use. I mean, I grew up in a pretty secular world where notions of sin weren't really operative, except in a general way, like the air is. I'm thinking the word I would rather use is danger. Susan Sontag once said that the only time that sex was safe was between the invention of the birth control pill and HIV, because the number of women that die in childbirth is incredible. But of course, there were all sorts of things to be afraid of before HIV came. I mean, there were all sorts of STDs, and hepatitis was the first one I got. I had them all. So there was always danger involved. Even the most sort of vanilla sex could be dangerous. I mean, you didn't have to be into scat or fisting or anything like that to think you were doing something that might take you to the hospital. So that was part of the thrill of it, of course. We were outlaws. John Ritchie wrote a book about it. And it wasn't so much that we were violating a moral or religious code, but that we were tempting the body all the time not to betray us. So those are the terms I would put it in from my own experience.
And Evan, would you say that in your book or in your life that you feel like you're experiencing a sexual revolution now?
Absolutely. So PrEP has created a new sexual revolution, particularly for queer men and trans folks. This is happening, and it's something that's not really being covered outside of the queer community. So many straight people have no idea what Truvada PrEP even is, or that this is possible. So yeah, it's fun to be participating in and documenting that sexual revolution. And with the current changes in our country, it's only going to get more pronounced. You know, now suddenly we have all the technology we need to suppress HIV in HIV-positive people and to prevent HIV-negative people from contracting the virus. We have everything we need. And the only thing we need now is access. And access is very rapidly being eclipsed. So get ready for a real serious sexual revolution.
There's a quote in your book, John, from Nan, who says, Nan in the book is a straight woman who the Yellow House is her house and she donates it to gay men for recovery groups. And I liked this quote a lot because I think, even though the book is set in 1983-84, I think, well, I'll ask it as a question, but you say, Seattle had always been the 1950s, even when it became the 1960s and 1970s. So I wonder if you would say that 1950s mentality, that cloistering, that fear of difference, that herd mentality, do you think that ever left Seattle, especially gay culture?
Yeah, good question. You know, actually, I think I stole that line from Jesse Walters, who growing up here in the 1960s, talked about it always being the 1950s. You know, when I got here, I remember I'm half Italian, and I grew up in an Italian neighborhood. And when I came to Seattle, I was living in Ballard at first, and I went to the QFC, and I said, "Where's the spaghetti?" And the employee said to me, "Oh, that's in the ethnic foods, the ethnic foods aisle." Which, yeah, I guess it is. You know, Italian is ethnic, I guess. But we were right there with like the Manischewitz matzah and the Goya beans, and you know, it was all that stuff. Yeah, I think it had. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote about 83, 84 was not just because it was the beginning, people started dying of AIDS here, but it's when Seattle changed from being a big town to a small city. I mean, now Seattle's a medium-sized city, but it became a small city first, and what's the big difference? The big difference is that not everybody knows everybody anymore. And when I first got here, that was really the case. Everyone knew who everyone was. And just a couple years later, that wasn't true anymore. And it wasn't just because the population increased. It was because people's lives were more private than they had been. I wanted Nan to really be part of that Seattle. She's of Swedish ancestry and from an old Seattle family. And I wanted her to be the voice of Seattle in contrast to that of the new people who were coming. And a lot of people were moving, a lot of gay people were moving to Seattle, not just from Montana and Idaho and Oregon, but from all over the place. It was going to be the new San Francisco. I remember people saying that. And it's never long, I mean, it's
People
never...
still say that.
Yeah, but you know what? Seattle has never lost the part of it that's Anchorage. You know, yeah, I mean, this is like the love child of Anchorage and San Francisco.
Or Anchorage and Butte.
And that's, now. I lived in San Francisco and was happy to leave. But anyway, yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
And what do you two think in terms of Seattle itself, but especially, you know, gay culture and it's sort of, like, I think, Evan, you talk a little bit about this sort of judgmental kind of perspective, you know, in terms of people not wanting to get on PrEP because they're worried that they're going to be seen as, oh my God, actually having sex, you know? Yeah. And so I wonder, and that to me is a very 50s mentality, right? But it's also a very current mentality in gay culture across this country, you know, no matter where you are.
Yes. So PrEP, Truvada as PrEP, and the birth control pill are startlingly similar as far as how people are reacting to them. And what keeps boggling my mind is that the folks who are the most resistant to PrEP and the folks who accuse PrEP of being a gateway to some sort of like buttfuck Babylon are gay people, gay men. You know, it's not like Fox News is saying those gays are gonna butt fuck. You know, that's not what's going on. It's coming entirely within the gay community of people who are saying, well, I don't need that because I don't participate in risky behaviors, except that if you're gay, you almost are always constantly participating in risky behaviors. And it's just nuts to me that so much of the resistance comes from within the gay community. Again, like most straight folks don't even know this thing exists. So it's not like there is a shame from the outside in. It's revealing, it's a great way to show us how much shame we have around sex in general. I mean, queers, how much shame we still have around sex in general, and then just being queer. There's a lot of shame around not using condoms. And the more people I've talked to, the more research I've done, the more it suggests that the people who stop using condoms when they get on PrEP were the same people who weren't really using condoms before PrEP. A lot of people on PrEP continue to use condoms because they don't want chlamydia and things like that. Other people are like, fuck it, chlamydia is curable. So, you know, make your own choices with your own body. Yeah, it's constantly a surprise to me that people are still talking about this in this way. And I find that of the people I talk to who refuse to get on PrEP, about a third, roughly, are people who just distrust big pharma. They don't want to take a drug that's not absolutely necessary. And I can empathize with that. I was right there before I got on the pill. The other 2/3 are people who are in this mindset of, if I take this pill, then I have to face that I might be a slut. And then like the mind jumps right there. Like, if I have sex and enjoy it, that must mean I'm a slut.
Well, it should mean that you're a slut.
Right. Like, I'm okay being a slut. Like, I'm perfectly fine with that. You know, like,
I mean, what's the point of being queer if you can't be a slut?
Not everybody needs to be, but like, throw me some dick, I'll catch it.
But I think I'm interested also, though, in that first third, because you talk in the book a little bit about how you think the group of people that is informed about PrEP, you know, and knows exactly, you know, what the medication does, knows how it's used, and chooses not to do it based actually on the information. In your experience, you feel like that group is growing, and I'm curious to hear more about that group, because I feel like that group is also invisibilized, you know, in a sort of, certainly in a gay cultural narrative. So you're talking about the sort of gay, what I would call, you know, this sort of a craving, this assimilation is craving, right? So, you know, we're just like you know, we want the white picket fence, you know, and the terrier and the whole thing, right? And so that's based on straight acceptance, right? So that's why, you know, gay people are so horrible to one another in many ways. But then...
What's your question?
My question... The question is, there's a part in the book in the end where you talk... So that's one segment of people who are shaming people for not being on PrEP, right? But then you're talking about people who are actually making an informed choice not to be on PrEP. And there's a part of the book where you say you feel like that group is growing, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about what you think, how that group is growing and how they are making that choice.
Well, what a lot of people have completely missed, you know, there's this rationalization of, oh, you know, PrEP is for serodiscordant couples. PrEP is for couples where one person's HIV positive and the other's not. Yeah, that's why we need PrEP. No, most people who are HIV positive are undetectable and are not transmitting the virus. So in couples who one person is HIV positive and undetectable, PrEP is usually redundant. Now, couples in which one person is undetectable and the other is HIV negative, they can still choose to use PrEP. David Schmader was on this stage a month ago talking about his choice, with his husband, that the husband does get on PrEP, even though David is PAWS undetectable. And that's a couple's individualized choice. But, I have friends, I have a friend in Japan whose partner is PAWS undetectable, and he's like, I'm not going to take PrEP. Why would I? My partner's undetectable. Yes, we use condoms. Yes, we're careful about what kind of sex we have. But to him, he just doesn't see PrEP as being necessary. So plenty of people who distrust pharmaceuticals, don't want to use unnecessary drugs, are being informed. They're informing themselves and saying, you know what, I don't really need this. If you have less than 3 sexual partners a year, you probably don't need PrEP. If you date someone and keep getting to know them before you have sex with them, maybe you don't need PrEP, especially if you are like me and you appreciate condoms and still use them. I got on PrEP because condoms weren't enough. Clearly 30 years of saying use your condoms haven't worked because we still have HIV. Does that answer your question?
Sure. I mean, I think actually for me that's really hopeful, because the point, I think in HIV prevention worlds, I think there's often this all or nothing mentality, right?
Yes.
And so even the last thing you said, that the condoms haven't worked, that's sort of the new, way of speaking in HIV prevention worlds. So condoms have worked.
People hate condoms. Straight people hate condoms. Queer people hate condoms.
And dental dams.
Yeah.
But this whole mentality where it has to be one or the other, right?
Yeah.
So condoms have worked for a lot of people and they haven't worked for other people,
Yeah.
right? And the same thing with PrEP. I mean, the point for me of having more choices is to actually be able to choose. And I think there's a lot of rhetoric in HIV prevention worlds now that says, like, PrEP is the answer. So if you're HIV negative, you have sex with a lot of people, get on PrEP right now. But there are lots of different ways to say stay safe. Condoms
Yes.
are included, et cetera.
Mhm.
And you're mentioning a lot of them. And so I feel like that's a more sophisticated way to be talking about it, rather than the way in HIV prevention worlds right now. I've said this a lot, but this whole thing, this whole end AIDS thing, right? They say end AIDS and there are 4 steps, right? One is get insurance, get tested, get PrEP, and what's the 4th one? Does anyone know? Something else.
Informed.
What is it?
Probably just get informed.
Something like that, right? So condoms are not on it, and a cure is not on it.
Yeah.
So those are
Yeah.
the 2 things that, certainly a cure is what ends AIDS. And so I think for me, a much more sophisticated analysis is what you're actually saying, which is, let's have more options to keep one another safe, to have slutty and transformative and challenging sex lives, or terrible and horrible sex lives and still stay alive, And so
if you really like unprotected sex with lots of people in a short amount of time, take PrEP. Do that. Otherwise, just make your own informed decision.
And Julene, I was struck. I'm glad you chose to read that poem about working at Lifelong, because I was really struck by that poem in particular. I mean, there's several poems in the book, but the fact that here you are working at an AIDS service provider, and that you were closeted about your HIV status, and also that this other person was also closeted. And I wondered if you might talk more about whether like the environment, the work environment in particular, kind of facilitates that closeting, rather than, because to me, nothing could be more inspiring for someone coming into an AIDS service agency than having someone who is also dealing with HIV. But I wonder if that's not the mentality of the organization as a whole.
So there's a few things going on. When I started working there, I wanted to learn everything I could about HIV and AIDS. I knew I was infected, and I was really excited to get the job. And so the HR person who was doing like a number of jobs, they didn't have a standard HR person at the time, was very open about being positive. And I was excited, and I said to him, so you're positive, I'm positive, what's the best approach here? And he said, keep it secret on it.
Oh, wow.
And I respected that, and he died within that year, the first year I was there. So I decided I was going to follow his advice and keep it private. And the more I was there, the more I learned kind of why he probably had that attitude. But there was a lot going on. I was one of the early founders of the Babes Institute, the Babes Network, and our executive director at the time did not want another AIDS organization in town for more money to be split up, so she was fighting against it, and I knew that because I was inside the organization. So we formed a letter writing campaign to get that organization started, and that was very successful. But there was all these politics going on, and as I began to see them working there, I realized, it's better I am not out, because if you're out in an AIDS organization work is 24/7, and you would be, they would work you to the bone and use you in other ways as well. And so I was protecting my time and my energy while I was there, and I had to do that because you give a lot working in any nonprofit, any social service agency, and so there was a lot I learned over time, and eventually I started coming out more to my team, and that was, okay, that became okay, but that was with my social work team. And then working with clients, there's the whole professionality of not sharing too much personal information with clients. So I had that professional stance as well, not to tell everybody, and that was also a form of protection in a way. And there were certain people that at different times had saw me in a different role, and so there were a few people that knew my status, but it was very few and far between in terms of clients I worked with that might have known my status. So yeah, it was a very, very much living a double existence while I was working there. My own private information of knowledge about myself and how I portrayed myself there was different.
And in what ways do you feel like that protected you?
Well, it protected my time. I think I would have been asked to do more things than I was ready to emotionally, or wanted to put myself out there as a positive person, put it to the public. I think they would have asked me. So that way, for sure. And just in terms of, every time and this book it's not easy coming out in a book now, but every time you come out, it takes a certain amount of emotional energy. For me, anyway. I don't know, everybody's probably different, and gay men are different. As a woman, there's a lot more questions. I'm interfacing with a lot of people who don't know that much about HIV and AIDS, so then there's a lot of explanation, there's a lot of taking care of. And, in my role professionally, I didn't want to blur those boundaries of who's taking care of who. I was there for them, and that's pretty clear in social work and in counseling.
And I think in the book you also sort of point to the ways in which the structures of care, the funding apparatus, the organizational sort of structures end up failing so many people, right? Not being able to provide, for people's needs based on this sort of daily bureaucracy. And I wondered if you might have thoughts, since you worked in AIDS services for 21 years. I mean, certainly that has not changed,
Right.
And so I wonder if you might have thoughts, or any of anyone here, on what might change to make that actually possible.
Well, I've had times when I've stood up and fought for different clients, and worked with other organizations in ways that help particular clients. But it takes going beyond, and it takes working in ways to change the system, which is very hard to do in these big bureaucracy systems. It's very hard to change the rules. It's very hard to change people's minds and hearts to make those changes in the rules. go to a lawyer. They have to go through a lawyer. Everything's legal. Everything is safeguarded through the paperwork and the way things set up. I was thinking of the poem I have about the man who couldn't get housing because he wasn't AIDS disabled. You have to be AIDS disabled. You can't just be HIV to get, like any type of housing support. So there's all kinds of rules and regulations, and you have to prove everything triple times over. You have to show your income. If you don't have income, you have to get a letter from Social Security, from disability, and from unemployment that no, you're not getting these things. And so you have to prove, you have to say how you're surviving if you're not getting any income. There's so many things you have to do to prove who you are and what's going on for you to the larger powers that be.
And the cultural narrative is that our government's just giving money away.
Yeah, yeah, which isn't true at all. Yeah.
So John, the Yellow House in your book, it's a central space. It becomes the central space for gay men in recovery, but it's also a space for gay men to find support and deal with the emerging AIDS epidemic, and their own fears, their own relationships, their own, and so in that way, it's this space for nurturing. But I think the book itself sort of really points to also the way in which it's space for nurturing and also a space for hypocrisy. And I wondered if you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Sure, it was a place for support, particularly since things started going on at the Yellow House because gay men had been kicked out of a church earlier, and so there was a sense of the Yellow House being a place that sort of rescued. One thing we have to be careful about is all of the nostalgia for those years. You see it a lot among ACT UP veterans who have these reunions, and the camaraderie of those years was so powerful, and particularly these are a lot of young people, that there's a nostalgia for the struggle, for being in the trenches at the front lines, which I'm very uneasy with. And it's very easy to be nostalgic about gay life in Seattle in the early 80s when, the bar scene was much more interesting than it is now. And you can say that about any American city. But also the camaraderie that misery forced upon it. And there was hypocrisy. There was a lot of lying. Jeff and Henry aren't really in the program, they're around the program. And that still goes on today. And I don't necessarily want to call that hypocritical, but if you lead people to think otherwise, then perhaps it is. It's the way that the best generation talks about World War II. My father comes alive talking about 1944, 1945. These are not years anyone would want to repeat, but there's a kind of there's a kind of trauma that one can wear proudly, and I understand that, but we shouldn't get too comfortable with that. And 83, 84 were pivotal years for us here in Seattle in that regard. I mean, we really thought, I remember thinking that America was going to sort itself out. In the late 1970s, I was living in New York, that America was going to sort itself out, and there were going to be these great gay cities in America, totally gay, like San Francisco would be totally gay, and New York would be, but then there would be these cities that would be totally black, totally African American, totally wonderful black cities like Atlanta and Detroit. We were all going to sort ourselves out.
Atlanta's pretty gay.
Pardon me?
Atlanta's pretty gay.
Well, whatever. It's pretty black too. And the sense that everything was going to improve. People talk about the 70s as a terrible decade. It was a great decade, and because there was a sense of optimism that we carried from the 60s, you know, I would tell my students, I only had 6 happy years in my life, and that was from April 1975, the end of the Vietnam War, which threatened my life, and the start of AIDS in July 1981. And I used to feel sorry for myself. I used to think, oh, I only had 6 years. How many people in the world would love to have 6 risk-free years? Like 99.99% of the world. I had 6 years where I was unafraid, 75 to 81. And the 70s nostalgia is there, but there's also the nostalgia of the early years of AIDS, particularly because ACT UP and other organizations were so goddamn successful. And trying to replicate that since has been very hard.
And Evan, you were born in 1982, is that correct?
That is correct.
And so I think I'm interested also in...
You should see the picture of me in the attic.
Oh, which attic?
Never mind.
Never mind. You can't just tease us.
It was a Dorian Gray reference.
Oh, okay. So I'm interested in the way that you describe. So by the time that you came of age sexually, protease inhibitors were already in effect, and people were already talking about AIDS as a long-term manageable condition. But the way you grew up was with the fear of there being a needle in the phone. You hit the payphone. What was the what story that one was?
So in grade school, in elementary school, we would tell each other this urban legend that you shouldn't reach your finger into the coin return of a payphone because people put AIDS needles in there. And then you would prick your finger, and then the phone would ring, and you'd pick it up, and someone would say, "Welcome to the world of AIDS." And so it was this weird, like, Sleeping Beauty meets The Ring. Yeah, so by the time I was sexually active, AIDS was a manageable long-term chronic condition, but all the superstition was in by then. Like, just terrified that I would get it.
And I think, I feel like there's so much of this sort of rhetoric about a generation now that hasn't experienced that fear. And I think that your story, actually, which is not the generation that's growing up right now, but I think points, at least for me, to the ways in which the stigma of HIV, the fear of contagion, the fear of an early death is not just, the fear of someone coming of age in 1983, or, I came of age in 1992, or, but it's something that's so deeply inscribed that I wonder, I don't know, I just see a lot of rhetoric that I'm really uncomfortable with, where people are like, oh, people grow up now and they're not afraid of HIV, and I actually do not think that's true. I think the way that the stigma exists just migrates into different places, like literally in the world and also in our bodies, in our lives, in our minds, and in the way we experience the world. And I wonder if you could speak to that, perhaps. Or perhaps your story itself speaks to that. That's how I read it, in a certain sense. Like the fear that you have, or that you express in the book, was certainly no less than the fear that I grew up with, and certainly was perhaps more than the fear of people who came of age, before, HIV, and so I wonder if that the way people think about generation, and kind of what you're speaking to also, the way that there's this nostalgia that sort of covers over our actual experiences and actual, and makes, there's always something that's the golden age, right? So the golden age never existed, right? And the only way a golden age exists is if we can make it right now. But maybe that's going too far. But I guess that question about how stigma reinscribes itself and takes place in different ways, both personally and generationally.
So I think about my nephews. One was born in '99, one was born in 2002. They've always lived on an Earth that had the internet. They have zero memory of a time when there was not internet in everybody's home. I have zero memory of a time when there wasn't AIDS. I mean, I didn't know about AIDS until a certain age, but it was always there my entire life. So, whereas folks like John and Julene, you were probably young adults before at least before the yeah. I'm trying not to.
Yeah. You can take the word young.
Glamorous, sassy, sexual beauty.
I mean, you were probably at least 16 when AIDS hit. Yeah. So for you, it was a sneak attack plague that came in and started killing off all your friends. And for me, it was more like a child molester. You know, we learned about pedophiles and AIDS at the same time in my generation. It was like, now, but you got to be careful because there's this thing out there that's going to kill you, and you know, that's powerful. That it would be that sort of shadowy thing just on the periphery. And I knew about AIDS before I knew I was gay. That's how I grew up. That is my psychological landscape of the world.
And something I think, Julene, that you point to in one of your poems, you say something about how the virus owns you, right? And you're speaking, you know, of the current time of the poem, and I think in a way that sort of challenges this narrative. You know, again, this is sort of a narrative about, you know, HIV as a long-term manageable condition, but also the ways in which it's not manageable, right? And the way that the unmanageableness of it is invisibilized in favor of this sort of positivist narrative. And I feel like, you know, in a lot of ways you kind of talk about the ways in which it's not manageable, you know. And I wonder if you want to speak to that.
I think a lot of people have the impression, well, now you can take a pill for it and it's not a problem. And that's just, for somebody who's newer infected, that's possibly true now because the medications are better. But you know, you're looking at somebody who waited, didn't take the only pill that was available when I learned I was positive. So that's why I survived. I didn't take AZT. And I was very skeptical of the medications. And I waited until my T cells went below 50 and I had my first OI, opportunistic infection, to start taking the medications. So, and I watched it. I watched my numbers go down steadily, just like they said they were going to. And I knew I was at risk, and I was taking the Dapsone to protect from the PCP. But I didn't, I was making a conscious choice. My body was an experiment, and I was going to see what happened. And what happened, happened. And I have chronic nerve damage from that, from the OI I had. So, you know, and I have chronic skin problems. And, you know, it's not so easy. I mean, yes, there are people that it's easier for, maybe, but of all the people I've known through the years, and a lot of them are other people that worked with me, alongside me. One I referred to killed himself because he couldn't stand the skin problems. You know, it's not an easy disease to live with. It's not a piece of cake. It's not something you should do, you know, consider lightly, even with the medications. And I also have problems with, you know, the drug companies. You know, I'm one of those people all along, very skeptical, very non-conformist to mainstream society. So I did not want to buy into that. But, you know, at some point, another poem says, at some point we all take the meds. That's what you have to do, because you have to survive. And so you're surviving, but that's different than thriving, and that's different than living without the virus.
And I think another thing you point to in one of your poems is the kind of dark humor that you know, people with HIV or long-term survivors develop in order to, you know, experience the world in order. And I think also, John, you point to that in the book where there's a couple who are at the Yellow House and they're naming their lesions, right? So each of their Kaposi's lesions, you know, has a name, and there's a kind of like sassiness to that, which I wonder if you want to speak to that also. Because that comes through very strongly, in your poetry.
Naming your last T cells, you have 2 T cells, giving them a name, that's part of the humor. And I had a friend who that was his situation, and he's one of my heroes because he's still around. But when you have 2 T cells and you're naming them, that's black humor. And I think I've always used black humor to survive through the sexual revolution. I use black humor. So for me, that is a way of survival, and I see it. I've seen it strong in the field and in the work and with friends. So, you want to say?
Yeah, well, there's always been humor. There was humor on the plantations. There were humor in Auschwitz. But we really had humor. What can't, because gay men like to be tasteless, so much. I wish someone would collect in a book, all of the jokes we had, about AIDS. And I find myself now in 2017 with Trump as president making jokes all the time about Trump. It's just the natural reflex, and I treasure those jokes. I treasure those jokes we told in '83 and '84. What's the hardest part about telling your parents you have HIV? Convincing them you're Haitian.
That joke might come with some baggage that people might want to unlearn also.
Well, you have to remember what people were saying back then. But
I saved cartoons that were a local man here who did cartoons that were in one of the early journals, and I saved. I have them in a book at home. I love the humor, the dark humor.
Yeah, one of the things we all know now is we have to collect these stories.
Yeah.
We have to collect the ephemera. We have to talk to long-term survivors. I meet people that say, well, there's a cure now for AIDS. That's what they say. They say there's a cure now for AIDS. And it's not really a problem anymore. So we're not interested in books, novels, poems about it anymore. Well, if you said that about the Holocaust, if you spoke to a group and you said, well, we have enough now. We can stop. You would be ripped a new asshole, but somehow we have this idea that it's over with now. And new things will come down the pipeline, I'm afraid. And yes, condoms with PrEP. And I think that around the country, in Los Angeles and New York and on the internet, a lot of collecting of material is going on now, and it's very important work.
Even the Mohai has some artifacts from ACT UP and things like that.
Yeah, not many. Yeah, they could have more, but I wrote a book about 1983, 30 years after 1983, and people said, well, weren't you a little slow? But I don't consider this a story which is over with, and in fact, as time goes by, the lessons you draw from that time are deeper. So I encourage people to write.
Maybe we'll leave it there. So if anyone wants to come up and tell us their darkest humor joke, while also unpacking any baggage that might need to be taken out of it.
I usually help people pack rather than
pack. Okay, packing,
Yeah.
Unpacking, experiencing sexual splendor right here. We're all for it. Getting some dates. Let's see. If anyone wants to further explore some similar issues, I'm co-hosting a book group with Tony Radovich. It's going to be on February 23rd, and we're going to be reading Martin Duberman's Hold Tight Gently, Michael Callan, Essex Hempel, and the Battlefield of AIDS. It's a dual biography about Michael Callan and Essex Hempel. We'll be at the Capitol Hill Public Library 6 p.m. on the 23rd, so there's still time to read the book, and it's brilliant and juicy and delicious. The next Contageous Exchanges, which happens every first Wednesday here at Hugo House. The next one will be on March 1st, and that will be with Amani Sims and Sarah Dowling, two very different poets. It's going to be a really good combination.
I would watch Imani Sims lick stamps. Like I'll go to anything she does.
Well, perfect. I love that. So, thanks everyone. Come up and talk to us. There are some books for sale, some of Julene's.
Yep.
And Julene's new book will be coming out. Oh, no books. Okay. So,
I'm taking pre-orders for the Prep Diaries.
Oh,
it'll be
pre-orders,
out either
yeah.
March or April. So if you want to pre-order now, it is on an indie publisher, so pre-orders basically fund the printing. So pre-orders are good.
And
Let
I
me know.
have, and I have postcards I can give out about my book as well.
and I can give hugs. So, if anyone wants a hug, please come forward. Thanks everyone for